Hey, Alex. Howdy, hi. And hey, everybody else who might stop by at some point. The camera's off still. I'm still trying to figure out a setup that works. So I'm sorry. There's no me. But I am going to finish this night. I just know it. So I'm going to dive straight back into it. I hope you're doing okay. Brian, sorry. I was calling you Alex. But all right, chapter 27 of Night Shift of Charlaine Harris. Back in her own kitchen, blessedly alone, Fiji slumped at her kitchen table, and the spell she'd been working on abandoned before her. Her spell bowl was full of odd ingredients, and she'd been wrapped in her work until she'd gotten the phone call to go over to the pawn shop. And the absurdity of being a virgin in this place and at this moment had come back to bite her in the butt, maybe literally. Now that she'd had a little laugh at the absurdity of her situation, she was bleakly aware this was one of the worst days of her life. After she did a quick rifle through of bad day memories, she revised her evaluation. This was the worst day. Not only to have her virginity common knowledge, but to be required to have public sex to stop the end of the world as she knew it. All right, she said out loud, let's pretend I don't feel this is all about me. Something you want to talk about? Mr. Snuggles said from somewhere under the table. Yes, she said simply. The cat emerged from his hiding place and jumped up onto the other kitchen chair, then to the table. He looked at her expectantly. Get on with it, Mr. Snuggles said. I can't read your mind, even if I wanted to. Fiji explained. She had to go over some points a couple of times because Mr. Snuggles did not understand why it was so embarrassing for a human to have sex in front of other humans. He also did not understand why she cared who saw her body. It's only a vehicle, he said, clearly puzzled. You just ride around in it. Well, true enough, she said, but I sure need to take my vehicle into the shop and get some dings hammered out. There's nothing wrong with you, the cat said. He seemed to be digging around for something nice to say. You're soft and warm, he said. You smell pretty good. You would look nice carrying cubs. Oh my goodness, she said, letting her head fall to the table with a dramatic thunk. What if I get pregnant? You would have to spend a lot of time with a baby, Mr. Snuggles said, looking much less pleased. You might forget to feed me. How could I forget, she said, raising her head to cast a baleful eye at the cat. You remind me often enough. Mr. Snuggles looked off into the distance regally. After a moment, he abandoned the pose and asked, Will you need me for the ceremony? I think, as my familiar, you definitely better be there. You boost my power. Mr. Snuggles looked as pleased as a cat can look. I can't transform into a big man, the cat said, so I'm afraid I can't help with the sex thing. Fiji thought she'd thrown up in her mouth a little bit at the idea of Mr. Snuggles becoming a man to have sex with her. Thanks anyway, she said in a strained voice. I have some candidates. Splendid, Mr. Snuggles said. Will they draw straws for the honor? Fiji glared at him. You're being a jerk, Snug. The cat looked bored. After a second, her anger collapsed under the weight of her worry. What about what would Aunt Mildred have done? She asked Mr. Snuggles. He looked somewhat more interested. Mildred would have used a spell to determine the right sperm donor, he said, after much thought. What about her personal preference? Fiji looked away as she asked. That would have been interesting to know. I think, though, that the spell would have been her choice. Mildred was not a hot-blooded woman. She did not think highly of humans who let her lust get the better of their judgment. Not helpful, Fiji muttered. Oh, did you want me to tell you to follow your heart? In that case, just call the blonde hunk across the road and tell him he's the one. He's a nice guy, Fiji said defensively, knowing that the words were inadequate. That's what you should go for then, a nice guy. Mr. Snuggles' words dripped with sarcasm. He lifted a leg and bent to clean his butt. There's nothing wrong with a nice guy, Fiji said in a voice that was almost a snarl. Oh gosh, no. Let's skip 3 powerful were-tigers, both the mature one and the younger one, and the really young one, and the angels, and the psychic, and the half-demon hunk with the long black hair, and the vampire. Let's go for the plain vanilla human with the tragic life. He turned away pointedly. If you weren't a small animal, I'd take you down, Fiji said. She was so angry it took her a moment to realize how ridiculous that was. Her mouth twitched. You could try, Mr. Snuggles said coldly, and turned around to give her a glare. Oh, you think that's humorous. Fiji couldn't manage to laugh, but she smiled. You'll definitely have to be there, she said. All hands on deck. It'll be dangerous. Mr. Snuggles said, the upside of this whole situation is that Rasta has been gone. I suppose they'll bring him back afterward. Sure, if there is an after. Joe and Chewie miss Rasta. The cat made a sound just like hacking up a hairball. Fiji realized he was laughing. Manfred should have let him get run over that day, Mr. Snuggles said. Brainless ball of fur. There were many things Fiji could have said in return, but she kept her mouth shut. She decided that the next day would be dedicated to looking up a spell to help her choose her deflowerer. And that sucks, she said as she brushed her teeth. Hey, Mongo, howdy hi. Thanks for stopping by. It's really nice to see you. Hey, Dee Dee, thanks for coming too. It's always nice to have some peeps pop in. The camera is not on. Sorry. I haven't decided on where to stick it yet. And phrasing, I know. Sorry. All right. Chapter 28. What happens if this doesn't work? Daedric asked his father. Nothing good, Quinn said after a moment. He and Daedric were taking turns spray painting a white circle. It encompassed the entire crossroad, and to be sure it was large enough, they were including corners of sidewalk, edges of buildings, and one fire hydrant by the Midnight Hotel. Quinn cast an eye along the curve of the line and decided it was good. He continued, I guess the town will disappear, or the demon will kill all the people living here, and then begin to rampage, to make up for lost centuries. Daedric, I think it would be better if you leave town. I'd like to send you to stay with a friend of mine in Louisiana. Run? Daedric was outraged. No, Dad, I'll fight with you and the Rev. We're tigers. We are tigers. I don't think even were-tigers can beat a demon, Daedric. It's not like ordinary prey. I've never seen a demon. Daedric took the spray can from his father, taking his turn drawing a section of circle. As the traffic went through the stoplight, he had to wait until it was clear either way to continue. I have. I fought a half-demon in the pits, like Sylvester, and it tore me up. But you won. Daedric glanced at the center of the circle, under the spotlight. He estimated they were making the circle fairly even. Quinn had stood under the light for a moment, holding the string, and Daedric had run with it, stopping every few yards to put down a reference mark. They'd had to do it quickly, but it had worked. Yeah, I won, but I think because she's already had about that day, and I was fresh. Tell me about the pits. They stopped painting the circle while they talked, and Quinn glanced up at the evening sky. He was tired. It had been a busy day. I'll tell you if you still keep walking while we get this done, he said. What's it like, Gladiator? Daedric asked. He just watched that movie on the hotel television. Yes, except real. My own blood, my own pain, my own fear. Every time I went in, I was not sure I would come out. Every fight might be the last. I didn't like that person. I didn't like the person I became while I fought. But I had to fight. To save your mom and your sister. Quinn nodded. To save them. Were they grateful? I think they were, way deep down, Quinn said. But my mother, because of her ordeal at the hands of the hunters, was crazy. And there were some obligations that are too painful to acknowledge. Some debts too big to be paid. I hope I never owe anyone a debt like that, Daedric said. I hope not too, son. The circle was almost complete. Quinn thought it would have been better to allocate the painting to Lemuel, who could have done it at night. There were interested spectators in the windows of the hotel, but no one asked any questions or tried to stop them, which was one of the benefits of living in Midnight. Quinn looked up at the man on the upper floor, the one who rented the room with a great view of the pawn shop. Their eyes met. The man's face stayed blank. How are we going to keep people out of the circle that night? Daedric said, after they'd worked for a while in silence. Regular people. Considering only 5 cars have gone through the light while we've been trying to get the circle sprayed, and it's evening now, I'm not too worried about that. I'm more concerned that some of the hotel people might look out their windows and get alarmed just at seeing a couple having ritual sex in the middle of the road. If they call the police, the consequences will be really bad. But I expect defense of the circle will be up to Joe and Chewie, and maybe Sylvester can seal us. I don't know how good a shaman he is. I think it was a late calling of his. Joe and Chewie aren't anything like I thought they were when I met them, Daedric said. There's something cold and scary about them when you go below the surface. There's way more than they seem, and it's a deep difference. They're very good at acting like regular guys, Quinn said, down at the section he'd just painted. The circle was now complete. I think of Joe and Chewie like they were my uncles, but they kind of scared me at the meeting. It cost Daedric something to confess this. Quinn could see. That's a reasonable reaction, son, Quinn said. You don't mess with angels, even fallen ones. The demon, was he a fallen angel too? Good question, and they don't always tell you the whole story. This is God stuff. But my understanding is that demons and devils used to be angels too. Yes, but God, whatever name or he or she wears, can read hearts and minds and know the degree of evil and rebellion in each. The lust for power can corrupt even the best. So some got banished utterly and early to a different realm, and some were thrown to earth after the new coming, like Joe and Chewie. But maybe that's all bullshit. I know some half-demons who are really good people. Daedric made a face. Does that make you feel weird? Talking about gods and demons? Yes, it does. I should spend more time thinking about it than I do. I don't like to think about a god looking at me and judging me. I don't think anyone enjoys that idea. The love part, yes, but the being found wanting part, we're all worried about that. Daedric gave Quinn a startled look, as if he'd supposed his father would have ventured into such deep waters. Not you, he said. Not you, Dad. Quinn laughed and put his arm around Daedric's shoulders. They'd been standing outside the hotel, and now they went in. Marina, behind the desk, smiled at Daedric in a very womanly way, and Quinn tried not to sigh. He'd had the talk with Daedric when Daedric was a little tyke, because he'd known all too soon Daedric would need to know the facts. Daedric was good-natured and charming, and also outstandingly handsome, but there was a touch of feral about him that made the boy truly magnetic. Quinn didn't think he himself had ever been as attractive as his son, so he was really proud of Daedric's lack of conceit. That was where the Rev had proved to be a very good guardian. Vanity didn't stand a chance with the Rev around. Quinn ran up the stairs to his room as Daedric and Marina exchanged a few words before Daedric was back to his job of dusting, vacuuming, and mopping the lobby and the bathroom off of it. The apocalypse might be coming, but work had to go on. Quinn called up the diagram of the venue of the next wedding he was hired to produce. In this case, a true production. Almost a three-ring circus, he thought. Belda and Raymond, both true shapeshifters, would be tying the knot in 2 weeks. He paused for a moment when he pictured the bride and groom. He wondered if he'd ever get to have his own conventional marriage. His mate, Tigerian, hadn't survived, and his mother, too, was dead. They'd been the only two full-blooded female were-tigers he'd ever known. But he had a son, which was all he could ask for. Quinn decided he'd be glad to find a woman of any heritage. I'm a little old to be making such a revolution, he thought. But he was smiling. It was doable. Chapter 29. Nothing the next day went as planned. Nothing. While the inhabitants of Midnight were preparing themselves for one crisis, which would fall in one more day, another presented itself without any of them seeing it coming, even Manfred the Psychic. Just at 8 o'clock in the morning, a big vehicle rumbled into town from the east. Joe and Chewie were running the water, the shower and the sink respectively, and they didn't hear the sound as anything special. It roused Teacher, though, because he'd driven a vehicle that sounded like that at one point in his life. He pulled on his shoes and hurried out of his trailer. No one in the hotel, except the man who lived in the front room, overlooking the pawn shop, gave it a second thought, and he only thought how out of place it seemed. The rumble gradually subsided into silence in front of Midnight Pawn. Lemuel's shift was over, and Bobo hadn't come down yet, so no one came out of the shop to see what was happening. This vehicle is an abomination, the Rev whispered when he heard the noise of the motor. He was kneeling in prayer before the bare altar in his church. The Rev liked to start the day with prayer. Daedric lived with the Rev, so his attendance was obligatory, and that morning Quinn had joined them too. The Rev had spent the previous day reducing a chunk of hawthorn tree to ash, and Quinn had put the ash in a bucket. But all that was on hold as the Rev cut short his prayer, and the three men came out of the church to look at the abomination. "That's a stretch hummer," Quinn told Daedric. Quinn never seen one before. Since Quinn was an event planner, he was well versed in ostentatious vehicles. Daedric was impressed, but Quinn saw that the Rev was having a bad reaction to the hummer. The old man's eyes went golden. He was sensing a threat, so his tiger was getting close to the surface. At his age, the Rev could change any time he wanted, as could Quinn. But Daedric still had to have the moon's help. So if it came to fighting, Quinn laid his hand on his son's shoulder. "You have a key, I think. Run, wake Olivia. Tell Bobo to get out of the shop. Hurry." Daedric streaked across the road to unlock the side door of the pawn shop. He disappeared inside. Standing on that landing, he could yell upstairs for Bobo and downstairs for Olivia. There were men getting out of the Hummer now, men as unlike the Rev and himself as if it were possible to get. They wore suits, but with gun belts underneath. They had rifles in their hands. They looked in all directions. They might as well have had high-class hoods tattooed on their foreheads. There were 5 of them plus the driver, who got out but remained by the vehicle. This looked to be like a small invasion. Quinn didn't want to transform in public, in broad daylight, but he didn't have a weapon, and he was certain he was going to need one. He wished he hadn't sent Daedric into the pawn shop, a wish that was confirmed when he saw all the armed men turning toward it. The pawn shop was the target. The newcomers began to move in the direction of the front door. They walked spread out, not in a clump. They knew what they were doing, Quinn thought. The men were watching. The men were watchful, glancing from side to side, but they seemed not to fear the Rev or Quinn, maybe because the two stayed still. Quinn couldn't risk making a move, though not until Daedric reappeared. Every second made him tenser. Just as he was about to run across the street to put himself between the invaders and the pawn shop, the Rev took an unexpected step. "Fiji!" the Rev bellowed in his deep voice. An outer front door of the witch popped. Fiji looked like a fluffy puppet in her nightgown and rose-colored bathrobe. Her eyes widened as she took in the armed men and their approach to the pawn shop. Then she came off her porch and down the path to the sidewalk, her hands held ready as if she were about to perform surgery. Her zebra-striped slippers thwacked against the concrete in the eerie silence. Not too surprisingly, the invaders did not recognize Fiji as a threat until she got halfway across the road, and then she froze them. "I feel like a one-trick pony," Fiji said. The Rev ran to stand by her. Quinn was right on his heels. Quinn stopped to examine the closest gunman, as still as a department store dummy. He was so overwhelmed with relief that he couldn't find the voice to tell Fiji how grateful he was. "No shame in that, if the tricks work," the Rev said practically. He began going from man to man, divesting each one of weapons and telephones. The telephones were Quinn's suggestion, and Quinn helped. Bobo unlocked the front door of the pawn shop, as if he were opening for business on an ordinary day, but he stepped out with a shotgun in his hands. Fiji, who had set the spell firmly, was going from man to man in the Rev's wake, looking into each face to make sure the man was good and frozen. "They all seem good for 10 more minutes," she pronounced. "Enough time for Olivia to come check him out." "You're sure she needs to be here?" Bobo said. "She might want to start getting in some licks. Olivia's not going to turn down an advantage. Why can't we just call Arthur Smith? Any reason why we wouldn't?" He looked hopeful. "I think this is about Olivia," Fiji said with conviction. Quinn thought so, too. Then he expelled a lungful of relief, because Daedric exploded through the front door with Olivia at his heels. Olivia strode down to the loose cluster of men, gun in her hand, and an incredulous look on her face. "You did this?" she asked Fiji. "I did," Fiji replied, her hands held ready at her sides. Olivia spared a second look for Fiji's bathrobe and slippers. "Good work," Olivia said, with a straight face. "Looks like the word of your marriage really did stir something up," Fiji said to Olivia in tones of the deepest sarcasm. Quinn saw Teacher Reed running across the road. Teacher was carrying a shotgun, too. "You come to help these men out?" the Rev called, and his voice hung over them like the reverberation of a bell. All the Midnighters turned to look at Teacher. "No, I'm coming to protect Olivia," Teacher yelled back. "Protect? Huh," Olivia said. "I wish Lem were awake. He'd love this." She walked over to the front door of the limo. "Let's see who rented this baby." The driver was one of the men with guns. She glanced inside the driver's seat. but evidently she saw no paperwork, so she went to the back. Fiji had reached the fourth gunman, but she caught Olivia's movement from the corner of her eye. "Olivia, I didn't check inside," Fiji yelled. At the same moment, the Rev bellowed, "Wait!" But Olivia flung open the limo door, and there was a loud crack of noise. Olivia seemed to be pushed back a step, and then she folded to her knees. Olivia fell over sideways, still trying to raise her own gun, and Fiji, with a wide-eyed intensity, dropped to her knees by Olivia, but she did not look down at her friend. Instead, she looked inside the Hummer. Her face was like nothing Quinn had ever seen. It shone with power and determination, and a complete lack of pity. Fiji extended her hand, and she concentrated. The man inside began screaming, and he did not stop until he was dead. After it was over, Fiji sagged to one side, exhausted. She couldn't say a word or stand, but by then the ambulances were there, because the midnight luck had run out. A passerby who'd stopped for gas at the convenience store had seen the shooting. He ran inside Gas and Co. to get away from the bullets and had called the police. Within 7 minutes of the call, the approaching siren split the morning air, but in those 7 minutes, the Midnighters worked hard. Teacher was positioned with his, perfectly legal, he assured them, shotgun, pointing at the invaders, who were sort of walked into a close formation by Quinn. He found it was like moving department store dummies, too, but they were quite a bit heavier. The Rev put the guns and telephones in a heap in the pawn shop parking area. Bobo and Teacher stood guard. Daedric was sent inside Fiji's house to keep out of sight, since he had no official existence. Sylvester simply stayed in Gas and Go. Madonna and Grady stayed in their trailer, and Chewie and Joe in their shop. Manfred, who poked his head out just in time to see Fiji take action, closed his front curtains and laid low. The hotel people were all out on the sidewalk, craning and marveling. Fiji released the imported gunman from her spell just at the right moment, as the police arrived. They all swung around belligerently, confused and angry at having been disarmed and corralled, which they didn't remember at all. The police asked Teacher and Bobo to put down their weapons, which they did instantly, and with every sign of being glad the police were there to take over the bad guys, one of whom was unwise enough to take a swing at Deputy Garcia. She cuffed him in the blink of an eye. As the police got the situation sorted out, the EMTs began to work on Olivia, and Fiji, who was unconscious. Lemuel slept the sleep of the dead. Daedric sat in the inquiring mind, looking out the window, as his dad had ordered him to do. The boy was distraught at the sight of Fiji and Olivia being strapped onto gurneys and lifted into the ambulances. But he could see Quinn was not in handcuffs, and the police were listening to him, so Daedric knew at least that part of it would be all right. "If Olivia had gotten shot at night," Quinn said to Bobo very quietly, "we could have just carried her downstairs to Lemuel." Bobo looked a little shocked. "Do you think that's what she'd have wanted?" Quinn nodded. "I think so. If she gets through this, we'd better ask her." "She just has to recover," Bobo said. "And Feech has to be okay. She just has to." "I've seen this before. I think she's exhausted from using such big magic," Quinn said, trying to sound reassuring. "And she's never killed anyone before. I'm sure that'll take it out of you." But Bobo, after he'd been accepted as one of the good guys, sat on the front steps of the pawn shop and stared into a future too bleak to endure. He tried 3 times to get into his truck and go to Davy to be with Midnight Wounded, but the police wouldn't let him. They had too many questions to ask. Chapter 30. Fiji woke up in the hospital shivering and bewildered. I'd killed someone. That was the first thing she remembered. He'd been gray-haired and mean-looking, the pleasure of triumph of shooting Olivia still stretching his lips into a smile. That had sent Fiji off the deep end. It almost didn't matter that he was about to shoot Fiji, too. She'd unleashed death on him. It hadn't been a real spell, but sheer will. And she lay in the pale green hospital room all by herself. She wondered where the power had come from. As best as Fiji could remember, she had simply had a clear, consuming conviction that this man must die for what he had done to Olivia. And he had died, but not quickly. His face had turned blue and his mouth had foamed, and he screamed with a dreadful catch, as though finding the air for screaming was a struggle. Then he kind of rattled deep in his throat. That had been it. A girl in scrubs came in, bent over to look at Fiji. "How do you feel, Miss Kavanaugh?" she asked. "Cold," Fiji said through trembling lips. "I'll get you another blanket." Fiji nodded and soon felt deft hands spreading another blanket over her. She was so grateful she could have cried. Is that better? The girl asked. Yes, thanks. How is my friend? Your friend? The woman brought in the same time as me. Been shot. She's in surgery. Don't worry about her. She's got a good doctor working on her. She's in good hands. This was not real information. She was being soothed. Fiji expected that the next nurse would offer to pray with her. I need something a little more specific than that, she said, but her voice was too weak to have authority. Now that you're awake, a doctor's going to come talk with you, the nurse said. She'll be here in just a minute. It was more than a minute. In fact, Fiji went back to sleep. She woke when an older woman in a white lab coat came in. Miss Kavanaugh, I'm Dr. Sheridan, the woman said. Her gray hair was in a smooth page boy, and her glasses, hanging from a chain, had flirty red frames. Can you tell me what happened to you? Fiji decided to tell the truth with some admissions. I saw my friend Olivia get shot, and I went to pull her to safety, she said slowly, editing as she spoke. She was finally feeling warm, and her voice came out stronger. She had stopped shivering. When I saw the man in the car who'd shot Olivia, he pointed the gun at me. I was really scared he was going to shoot me, and I couldn't protect Olivia or myself. And his hand kind of fell on the car seat, and he had a fit, I guess. I couldn't breathe, and I thought he was going to kill me, and maybe I fainted. I don't think you fainted, which is a momentary thing, Dr. Sheridan had said gently. I'm not sure if you hyperventilated or had a severe panic attack, or both, but you were unconscious for a good 10 minutes. We have to rule out some kind of heart event. So that's a long time to be out, Fiji said. That's a long time to be out. Dr. Sheridan was obviously trying to make Fiji understand that she'd suffered a serious event while trying to avoid setting off another panic attack. When you came into the emergency room, we ran an EKG, and the results were fine, so that's good news. Your blood work isn't all back, of course, but nothing popped out at first look. I kind of remember that, Fiji said, trying out a smile. She'd been woozy but awake by that time. Aside from feeling really tired, I feel much better now. Fiji knew exactly what was wrong with her. She'd strained her magic muscles when she channeled too much energy into killing the old man. She suspected she probably expended way more energy than she actually needed to use, and in consequence, her body had shut down to protect its depleted resources. She'd known better next time. For a few minutes, the doctor took Fiji over her medical history, which was very simple and blameless, and then over her family's medical history, which was quite typical of any fairly healthy family. By the time that was done, Fiji had decided she liked Dr. Sheridan. I'm glad to hear you're feeling better, but you need to consider having some tests run. We sure don't want to see you back here again. The doctor smiled at Fiji benevolently. Fiji had been enjoying the conversation because it was free of the man she'd killed and the demon under the road of whom she was going to have sex with. But now she felt tired, and reality crept up on her again. Let's talk about any more tests later, Fiji said. I'm really feeling better. Of course. Right now, the sheriff wants to talk to you. Do you think you're well enough to do that? Yes, Fiji said. Thanks for everything. Arthur Smith himself came in. Fiji was both glad and sorry to see him. Arthur was in uniform, and he looked tired, and he also seemed curiously content. After a second, Fiji decided that Arthur looked relaxed. So apparently he hadn't been the whole time she'd known him. Hey, Fiji, how are you feeling? He reached to take her hand and then withdrew his own so quickly, Fiji almost thought she had imagined the gesture. Perhaps he had rethought it after remembering she had some explaining to do. Better, she said. Now that her core was warm, she felt drowsy. She wished passionately that she were home in her own bed with Mr. Snuggles purring beside her. After all, she was still in her own nightgown, though her bathrobe was hanging on a hook on the wall, her slippers on the floor underneath it. Did anyone check on Mr. Snuggles? She asked, suddenly afraid something had happened to the cat. I saw him, Arthur said. The kid in your shop coaxed him out from under the Hummer. Fiji stared at Arthur. He was under the car, she said, almost asking a question. Oh, poor Snug, she added hastily. He must have been terrified. The boy carried him off, and I didn't see them again, Arthur said. Fiji relaxed. Daedric would feed and take care of Mr. Snuggles, or the cat would nag him relentlessly. Now, if only Arthur wouldn't start asking questions about Daedric. His lack of paperwork would be awkward. If you feel you're up to it, I do have some questions to ask you, Arthur said. He was standing by the bed rail, gripping it lightly. Sure, she said, trying to make her own hands relax. About the shooting. Sure. Have you ever seen the man, the one in the stretch Hummer? Never. Any of those men familiar to you? Arthur's wide blue eyes were fixed on her face. No. It was a pleasure to tell the plain truth. What happened? Just take your time. We're trying to figure this out. Every detail helps. Fiji was glad he'd told her to take her time. She did. I heard all the commotion across the street, and I came running, Fiji said. Best to admit that Rev had called her. That was not explainable. Rev and Quinn were standing in my front yard. Diedrich was just going in the side door in the pawn shop, or maybe Quinn told me he'd gone in. I don't remember which. Arthur nodded, to show her he was listening. I saw the men had guns. They were moving towards the pawn shop, slowly. Did you realize there was someone left in the Hummer? Arthur asked quietly. I never thought about it at all. The windows were tinted dark. The doors on the pawn shop were wide open. What happened next? I thought all the men were going to go into the pawn shop. I was scared for Bobo, and Olivia and Lemuel. Fiji took a deep, shuddering breath. Remember the fear. If she had really been uncertain about how she felt about Bobo, she now knew. Then Diedrich and Olivia came out, and Bobo. Do you have any idea, however out there, about why these men would want to be going into the pawn shop? Arthur's voice was gentle, but his eyes were intent. No, she said. I was stunned. Someone has to know why those men showed up, Arthur said. They're not talking, except to ask for a lawyer. Maybe Olivia can tell us. How is she? Fiji asked cleverly. Information. Still in surgery, and it'll be a while before she can talk, Arthur said. Can you tell me about her? Damn it, someone's got to tell me. About her wound? Not in any detail. One of my deputies talked to the doctor who's operating, and he seemed fairly certain she'd pull through. Good. Fairly certain was something. Just a few more questions. I can tell you're tired. Arthur looked concerned, and he might be, but he was also a cop. Fiji nodded. What happened to Ellery McGuire? Arthur said. Who? That's the name of the man in the limo? The one who shot Olivia? Yes, the guy who was filling up his car at Gas and Go said you stretched out your hand to him. What was that about? I begged him not to shoot again, Fiji said. He was pointing the gun at me, and Olivia was bleeding. She shook her head. It was horrible, and it had been. She could feel again the burning intensity that had seized her when she realized what she must do. He didn't think you spoke, the witness. I'm not saying I made a speech, but I said at least no. Okay, then, what happened? Then I killed him. He sort of crumpled and his hand dropped, Fiji said, as she told the doctor, and he turned really white and stuff came out of his mouth. I guess he's dead? She'd known he was dead, but she had to play this out. Yes, he's dead. But you had no weapon, right? So you couldn't have harmed him physically. I had no gun or taser or anything, she said truthfully. I just wanted him to stop. I was so scared that Olivia was dead. And she shuddered, remembering Olivia's blank eyes and the blood coming out of her abdomen, and knowing Lemuel was asleep and could not wake to save her, and knowing this meant the hospital and the chance Olivia really die, and being very, very angry. Fiji began to cry, and that pushed Arthur to finish up in a hurry. She's not dead, Fiji, he said, in as comforting a voice as he could manage. And we have all the attackers under arrest. I don't know how Bobo and Teacher rounded them up, but they have those assholes under control. But those assholes are not talking. She was really curious how they were going to explain their presence. Not a squeak. Arthur's mouth pulled down at one corner. Not until their lawyers get here. Smart, Fiji said. And professional. I want to go home. We've got some insurance, he said, smiling. Why not stay a while? The doctor wants you to spend the night. Make sure you're okay. She seems like a nice woman, Fiji said, but there's nothing wrong with me that time and rest won't cure. I was just overstressed and really scared, and I blacked out. That's between you and the doctor, Arthur said. You feel like having some company? I guess, she said cautiously, depended on who the company was. To her mild surprise, Chewy Villegas came in. Chewy was wearing his usual casual clothes, khaki, a polo shirt, loafers. He looked as unlike an angel with wings as she could imagine. He put his hands on hers. After glancing over his shoulder to make sure Arthur was out of hearing, Chewie said, "Thanks to you, we are all alive." "I don't understand," Fiji said. "If you hadn't cut off the head of the snake, I think they would have gone through midnight killing everyone they encountered to cover up the fact that Olivia was the target." "Surely you can't be killed." She felt almost embarrassed pointing that out. "But they didn't know that," he said, "and getting shot always hurts." Fiji didn't want to take any credit that wasn't her due. "I killed a man, Chewie, on purpose. I only thought of saving Olivia from getting shot again." "You did what was necessary. Don't fear judgment from Joe and me. We live under the old code," Chewie reminded her. His voice was cool and stern. "I wonder if I can go home soon," she said. She couldn't think of right and wrong any longer. "I think the correct thing to do is to call a nurse," Chewie said gravely. "She's supposed to remove the needle. What is going into you?" "Just fluid, I think, so if they had to give me medicine, they could administer it through the tube." She had to dredge hard to come up with the word administer. "You weren't hurt?" Chewie said, as if he were pretty sure that that was the case, but had to check. "I used all my magic," she explained warily. "I understand. You need bed rest and soup and to keep warm." Again he sounded like he was reading from a manual on the care and feeding of witches, but Fiji didn't mind. "That sounds so good," she said. Chewie said, "I'll do what I can to make that happen." He turned to leave her room. "Chewie," she said, "when I killed that man, the demon laughed." His shoulders slumped. "I was afraid of that," he said, and went to secure her release. Evidently, Chewie was very good at greasing the hospital skids. Faster than she would have believed, she got her release papers and was in a wheelchair, riding out the door to the curb. With some hesitation and faltering, she maneuvered herself into Chewie's car. She would have liked to see Olivia before she left the hospital, but apparently Olivia was still in surgery. 3 days until Saturday, Chewie said on the drive back to midnight, and suddenly Fiji understood why he was so anxious to have her back in town. She had to be in midnight to make her own personal sacrifice. "I'm sorry you brought that up," Fiji said. She'd been feeling fairly warm and cozy with Chewie, but not any longer. She rested her head against the cold glass of the window. She was far beyond caring if her hair was lopsided. "I am sorry," Chewie said, sounding awkward. "I know you are thinking about what you have to do, but I am thinking about the next century, and longer." "I think it's more like I'm thinking me, and you're thinking you," she murmured. He didn't respond. Either he thought she was saying something stupid, or he completely agreed. "Have you felt him moving?" she asked. Chewie sighed. "I have," he said. "Soon I will rise," the demon had told her. She had not heard his voice in a day or two. She felt him looming in the back of her mind, always present, but he'd been silent. She hadn't missed his voice at all. Her homecoming was oddly anticlimactic. Fiji had left in the middle of a tumult. She came back in the middle of nothing. There was no one on the street. The limo was gone. The body was gone. All the people who'd been in the street were gone. She didn't even see Olivia's blood in the pawnshop parking lot. Chewie pulled behind her house and ran around to open her door, helping her out of the car as solicitously as she'd been an aged Abula. Her back door was unlocked, and as she left it, Chewie offered his arm to help her manage to step up the porch and the back door sill. She was so weak. She hadn't felt this way since she had mono as a teenager. Chewie was seldom inside Fiji's house, so she was ridiculously glad she'd made her bed first thing in the morning. In fact, she'd been just about to take off her night clothes and get into the shower when she'd heard the Rose shouting. Chewie folded back the covers neatly so that Fiji could climb into bed. "Anything else I can get you?" he asked. "Just some water, please," she said, feeling almost shy about having to move around in her house. Chewie returned from the kitchen with a glass of water and a bowl of soup with crackers on a bed tray. Fiji had never seen the bed tray before, but the soup was Progresso Minestrone. She sat propped up and consumed it all. She felt much better. When Fiji was done, Chewie silently removed the tray. Fiji scooted down in the bed and turned on her side. Her comfort was complete when Mr. Snuggles padded into the room, jumped up beside her, and curled up by her hand, nudging it and even giving it a raspy lick. Fiji scratched his head and he purred, the most soothing sound in the world. She heard the back door opening and closing. Chewie had left. "Glad you're home," the demon murmured. "Fuck you," she said, and she fell asleep. When she woke up, it was dark outside. Fiji felt almost normal. She started to get up, but then she realized someone else was in the room. Lemuel, she said, almost certain she could smell him. Fiji, Lemuel said from the shadows, I'm here to thank you. I was glad to be able to do something, she said. She wasn't quite sure what to say next. Thanks for being here, she tried. And yet I wasn't able to be there early today when you saved Olivia, my wife. We wished you were awake, Fiji said. We were afraid we would lose her. You protected her with your body, and you killed the man responsible. Yes, Fiji said bleakly. I killed him. You're not sorry you saved Olivia? No, of course not. He was about to shoot again, me or her. I had to do it, but it doesn't sit real well. I can remember once I felt that way, Lemuel said after a moment. He came closer, perched on the edge of the bed. He took her hand. He was very cold. Fiji, you are a young woman. You haven't seen a lot of life. I don't want this for you. You have to kill. I wish I could say this is the only time you'll have to step up to defend this town and its people. But how can I know that? How did Aunt Mildred handle it? She was a pip, Lemuel said unexpectedly. Fiji choked back a laugh. What does that mean? She asked. Mildred was one of a kind, he said. She was sarcastic and downright, and she said what she thought. People were a little afraid of her, and they respected her. I liked her a lot, she said. Aunt Mildred had a sense of humor. She kept it well hidden, Lemuel said dryly, and she looked forward to seeing you every year when your family would visit. I don't remember meeting you those summers. I wasn't supposed to exist when you were a child. When you were a teenager, Mildred was afeared meeting a vampire would be so exciting that you'd tell your parents. They wouldn't have let you return. You think I'll get arrested? She said. It didn't seem likely to her, but she wanted another opinion. No, the medical examiner will say the old man had a heart attack or stroke or something. The coroner would never say, I think a witch killed him with magic. Am I right? She nodded, smiling just a little. I am more worried about what will happen to Olivia. Surely her true name will be known now, and her father will try to make amends to her. She never wanted to see him again. Peachy thought of Teacher charging down the sidewalk with the shotgun. At least now we know the Reeds weren't on the side of the gunman, she said. But when I feel a little better, I'm going to have to understand Olivia's past. We'll tell you, Lemuel said. Sleep now, friend. I'm going to Olivia. Before too long, Fiji did fall asleep again. Chapter 31. After a long internal debate, Manfred drove to a little bakery in Davie and bought 2 croissants and 2 muffins for Fiji. He did not try to pretend he'd made baked goods for her. He took the box to Fiji's. The front door still had the close sign up, so he went around to the back and knocked quietly, as befitted the house of an invalid. Come in, Fiji called, and he opened the door to see her sitting at the kitchen table. There were big circles under her eyes, and her skin looked as if someone had erased all her color. Fiji, you look like something the cat dragged in, Manfred said, and then cursed himself, especially when he heard a raspy laugh coming from under the table where Mr. Snuggles was sitting. I know, she said. I got all drained, Manfred, but I feel better today, and I know I'll be up to the ceremony on Saturday. I hope I'll be able to help prepare. Tomorrow Quinn and Daedric will go over the circle with salt and hawthorn ash. Rev's got the ash done. Sounds good. They both looked away, embarrassed. Neither of them wanted to talk about the public sex. What was there to say? Here, said Manfred, putting the box down in front of her, as though that would erase all awkwardness. You're always cooking for us, so I went and got you something. He shrugged. I thought about making them myself. You're lucky there's a bakery. Please have a seat, she said. Get a cup of coffee if you want, or I have tea. Fiji had recently invested in a Keurig and was happy with its versatility. Thanks, he said, and happily made himself a cup of tea and Fiji some coffee. He also accepted a croissant after Fiji had said firmly that she absolutely could not eat 2 croissants and 2 muffins. Somehow the butter dish appeared between them, and a knife and 2 little plates, though Manfred did not notice how that had happened. After a moment, he realized Fiji had set the table, and though he'd come over determined she would not have to stir a finger. Guiltily, Manfred asked if he could feed Mr. Snuggles for her. He was relieved when she nodded. He also went out to check her mailbox and to bring in her newspaper, and he put the dishes in the sink. He felt better about himself after that. By the time Manfred left, he thought Fiji was looking a little healthier. She told him she was going to shower and dress and open the shop. He remembered to ask her if there was anything else he could help her with before he left, and she thanked him again for the breakfast. Manfred left, feeling pretty good about himself for helping Fiji, though he didn't realize that he left the pastry box in the middle of the table, the dishes undone, and the butter out of the refrigerator. Fiji found it made her feel more like normal to do some cleaning, though she was moving slowly. She still felt a bit weak, though not as much as the day before. Moving at a snail's pace, but steadily, she pulled off her nightgown and got into the shower, which truly felt like heaven. It was crisply chill outdoors, and she turned the hot water on hotter. When she was very clean, she turned it off and toweled herself with as much vigor as she could summon. Fiji decided not to make any decisions this morning. She pulled on the first pair of jeans her hands encountered in the closet, the first sweater in the drawer, the first pair of sneakers she saw in her closet, the first pair of socks she had her hand lit on. Fiji was not terribly clothes conscious, but selecting things at random accordingly to convenience was a new level of carelessness. It was liberating. To complete the pattern, she put on the first pair of earrings she touched, eyes shut, in the jewelry box. As Fiji turned the sign to read open, she was feeling pretty darn good about herself. It would have lasted, too, if her first customer hadn't been one of the few people Fiji truly disliked, one of the women who sometimes came to her Thursday night class of witch wannabes. When she wasn't behind the counter at the Walgreens and Davy, Wileen Elliott, dressed in ensembles she imagined made her look authentically Wiccan and therefore interesting. Today, Wileen was wearing a peasant blouse, a voluminous skirt, and dramatic shawl that encircled her and was tossed over one shoulder. Since Fiji had canceled the night's meeting, Wileen had come to tell Fiji her theory about suicides. "We gotta get our little group together," she said, as if no other conclusion was possible. "We gotta stop them by working magic at the crossroad." It was amazing to Fiji how close to the truth Wileen had gotten for entirely the wrong reasons. Wileen explained her plan at length and scolded Fiji for not stopping the suicides on the spot. Amazingly, Wileen hadn't heard of the shooting the day before, which was an unexpected ray of sunshine. Fiji certainly wasn't going to bring it up. "You just don't have any get up and go," Wileen said, snorting. "Fiji, you live right here on the spot where all this hellish activity is going on. You have yet to cast a spell or say an incantation." Fiji didn't think that she had to defend herself. Wileen was hardly entitled to know the whole story of what was happening in Midnight. But at the accusation that she had done nothing, Fiji had to respond. "I live here, and I think I do what's going, and I think I do know what's going on," she said with some heat. In fact, she stood up behind the counter, her chair almost bouncing with the suddenness of her shift. Wileen took a step back. The woman actually brittled. Now Fiji knew exactly what writers meant when they said that. "When are you going to do something about it?" Wileen demanded. "You don't know what I've done," Fiji said, exasperated. "For all you know, I could have a cauldron of wizard lips and bunny tails simmering on the stove." Wileen looked very startled and actually made a move toward the hall door. But Fiji said, "That's private, Wileen." "Are you really doing something?" Fiji nodded. "Are you facing the powers of evil?" Wileen was incurably dramatic. She had rescripted her life to resemble a daytime drama. "Yes," Fiji said on impulse, "I am." Wileen gaped. "Really? Do you need my help at all?" It was brave of Wileen to ask, really, but Fiji didn't want to torment the woman. "It's being taken care of," she whispered with great significance. Wileen was delighted and frightened all at the same time. "Goddess be praised," she breathed. Though if Fiji was any judge, Wileen didn't have any conception of what goddess she meant. Fiji rang up the tarot deck and the mystical greeting cards Wileen had picked out. At least Wileen always purchased something, but she just buys things so she can carry around her purchases in an inquiring mind gift bag, so someone will ask her what kind of shop it is. Fiji thought. She gave Lorraine a courteous nod as she handed over the bag with the charge slip inside. Lorraine nodded back very seriously, as if they shared some great portentous secret. She departed in a flutter of skirt, and after a complete redraping of the shawl, Fiji collapsed back into the rolling chair behind the counter. She wondered if it would be so very bad if she had 2 grilled cheese sandwiches with her soup at lunch. If I'm thinking about food, I must be getting over being a killer, she thought. Mr. Snuggles gathered himself and jumped up onto the low work area below the counter. I've been over to see the Rev, the cat said. He has prayed for that man's soul, so don't worry any more about him. It was just weird how the cat often divined her moods and the subject of her thoughts. Of course, he was supposed to be her familiar, but Mr. Snuggles seemed more familiar with his own wants than with how to help her do witchcraft. How did my aunt get you to actually do some work? Fiji asked. That is a tactless way to put it, the cat said stiffly. I was just wondering. I know you were her familiar, but how did the relationship work? That's a more accurate question, right? Now you're mine, but I have seen you do anything that was familiar-like. Mildred picked me out as a kitten, he said. I was adorable, of course, and she knew I was special. Did she? Fiji was far more interested than she would have been under other circumstances. Were there any other kittens in your litter that could have been special cats like you? I had an excellent mother and 5 siblings, Mr. Snuggles said rather stiffly. They were very striking, of course. Of course. So when Mildred came to see us, we were born under the church, you know. I did not know that. We were. The Rev was most kind. He put food and water out for my mother so she wouldn't have to leave us for long periods of time, and he found us homes. Ah, I don't suppose any of your siblings would talk. The cat glared at Fiji. Of course not, though they were all delightful. I'm sure they were. Could you always talk to them from birth? No, Mr. Snuggles said, in a tone best described as frosty. I only discovered this ability when I was several months old and living here. I wonder if you would have talked if you lived with someone other than Aunt Mildred. I don't know, he said. He jumped down and walked away. She could hear his voice trailing away as he went down the hall, and she stood to look after him. Come to give a little comfort, and she asks about my family. My family, as if they could help being good, honest, plain cats. Impulsively, Fiji called, How come you were under the car? The cat looked at her over his shoulder. I was there because he needed a focus point. You needed to give him the biggest dose of bad you could, and my proximity helped, and that is what a familiar does. So, how did he die? You took his air, Mr. Snuggles said. You pulled it all out of him. Felt like a tiny storm in there. I took his air, she said, trying to really understand it. I held out my hand at him, and I took his air. The cat nodded. You did, and more power to you. He was a bad old bugger. Chapter 32. The day following the death of Ellery McGuire, the Reeds were afraid to come out of their trailer. We're in the open now, teacher said. I went down there with a shotgun when Mr. McGuire showed up. They know Melanie's dad hired me. Olivia, Madonna corrected him. We've called her Olivia for 2 years. We might as well keep on going. Mama play? Grady asked, bringing her one of his puzzles. Sure, honey, Madonna said, sitting on the floor with them. Oops. Just getting some water here, you guys. Since this was not her usual answer, Grady was delighted. His broad smile was so happy that Madonna had to smile back. We may not have a lot of time to play, little man, she told Grady. She dumped the puzzle pieces out between them and said, You put one in first. The puzzle was big and wooden, and Grady's little hands fumbled a bit, but he put the boat in the boat-shaped cutout, and teacher clapped. You're smart, Grady, he said, and bent to kiss the child on the head. We may need Grady to get us out of this mess, Madonna said. It's good that one of us is smart. We've got to make a living, and since we weren't open yesterday. There was a knock on the trailer door, which was such a rare occurrence that both the Reeds startled. Madonna held out her hand to Teacher, who pulled her up off the floor easily. They faced the door. I have to answer it, Teacher said finally. All right, Madonna whispered. She opened a cabinet that was above Grady's height and pulled out a Sig Sauer P220. I'm ready. Teacher grabbed up Grady and went to the door. He took a deep breath and opened it to the side awkwardly. He didn't want to block Madonna's line of fire. Joe stood on the steps. His face was calm and his hands were clasped in front of him. Madonna's gun hand fell to her side without her willing to do so. We're cool, Joe said. He nodded to show that that was his entire message. Then he left. This town, Madonna said when Joe was out of hearing. This damn town. At least we know, Teacher said, more philosophically. Couldn't ask for more straightforward than that. You're sure he meant it? Madonna returned the Sig Sauer to its hiding place. Yes, Teacher said, not even taking a moment to think it over. That was Joe, and he speaks the truth. I've never lived in a place like this, Madonna said, shaking her head. She took Grady from Teacher and nuzzled his neck. Mama loves you, little man. Mama, Grady said, and patted her on the cheek. Play. Mama did play with Grady for 20 minutes, and then she decided to open the diner for dinner. At least, Teacher said he'd help, since she told the local boy who bussed for her to take the day off. Madonna was glad she hadn't given Lenore Whitefield an answer about making the nightly meals for the residents' old folks in the hotel, because she would have had to scramble to get anything prepared in time. The little Reed family walked over to home cooking, and Madonna felt much better when she began food preparations. She was a woman of many talents, but this was the one that made her happy. Teacher's cell phone rang as he was setting the tables. He pulled it out of his pocket and looked at the caller. It's the man, he called to his wife, and answered the phone in a completely different voice. Yes, sir, he listened. Then he spoke. She's going to be fine. I bribed an orderly to listen, and look, 2 more days in the hospital, maybe, then home. He listened some more. No, I don't think you ought to come, Mr. Wicklow, he said, trying not to sound horrified by the idea. Her next of kin now is her husband. He might not want to see her. He might not want you to see her. You're the boss. You'll do what you want, of course, but if you have to wait until she gets out of the hospital. All right, then goodbye. How's Wicklow handling the situation? Madonna said, popping her head out of the kitchen. Her husband was putting his phone away, and he looked relieved. He's plenty worried about her, but now that McGuire is dead and Olivia's out of danger, I think he's scared of actually facing her again. And maybe the old man doesn't really want to know what Olivia does to make her money. Madonna shrugged. Girls got to keep alive. I think everybody at midnight knows Olivia's business. Everybody but us, her husband said bitterly. And that would be a thing. And that would be a good thing to know. He'd be sure we were on the job. We just can't get anyone in this town to talk to us. Madonna said, You better take that from Grady. Teacher swooped down on his son and took the pepper shaker away. You'll sneeze and wheeze if you eat that, and if you eat that stuff, Grady, he chided. Knees, Grady said, and Teacher laughed. For the first time since the break-in, Fiji came to eat in the cafe that evening. She gave Teacher a very direct look, and he looked back. And after that, she behaved as though the incident had never happened, or at least as far as Teacher could tell. Fiji seemed wobbly to Teacher, and he noticed that the other Midnighters all took a moment to hug her, or pat her, or just say a quiet word. And when she'd eaten, the Rev himself walked her home. Though Bobo wanted to, Teacher could tell. Madonna and Teacher cleaned up the kitchen, and were out of the door by 8:30. The night was dark and cool, with the promise of rain. Teacher stood looking up for a moment at the heavy clouds skidding across the sky, driven by the wind. It was less than 7 yards to the door of the trailer, but in the short space, Teacher went from thinking of playing a game on his laptop to fearing for his life. Lemuel stood between Teacher's family and home. and the only light available, a weak security light over the rear door of the diner. Lemuel's white skin seemed to glow like mother of pearl. Teacher bit back a scream. Madonna made a gulping noise, and Grady stirred sleepingly on her shoulder. If Olivia had died, you would have died at this moment, Lemuel said. You were coming to her aid, and they tell me. So you were saved, and then he was gone. Oh my God, Madonna said. Oh my God, Madonna said after a moment of shuddering silence. Oh my God. Teacher felt even more unsettled by the whole incident when he realized that Madonna had tears running down her cheeks. He had never seen his wife cry before. Later that night in the hospital in Davie, Olivia woke with a cold hand in hers. Lemuel, she said weakly. I was here last night, but you slept the whole time, Lemuel said. I understand you will recover. I talked to the doctor myself. Her room was dim, but not dark, and she could see his outline against the light coming in the particularly open door. Lem, she said, almost left you for good. If I'd gotten an inch to the left or an inch to the right. And me sound asleep, Lemon said bitterly. No use to you at all. He shot me, she said. Fucking asshole. He's a dead fucking asshole now, Lemuel said. I thought I heard one of the EMTs say that, Olivia murmured. I expected to see Fiji or Bobo today, but they said I couldn't have any visitors. Was that your doing? Yes, that was my doing. I'm sorry if you wanted company, but I was scared someone bad would come in, and I would not be here to protect you. Now that we are married, I had the right to prevent it. She nodded. Okay with me. I didn't feel like talking. Did I see teacher with the shotgun? Guess we know for sure why he's in midnight. I've had a talk with him and Madonna, Lemuel said. Now that I know your father hired them to protect you, not to kill you, we've come to an understanding. Did you scare him to death? Olivia said. She smiled at him. Pretty near. I'm going to stay here until I have to go close. Wait, I'm going to stay here until I have to go close to dawn, he said, smiling back. They're going to come in here to check my blood pressure, she said, protesting, already half asleep. Yes, I know, but they won't turn me out, he said. I'm your husband. You know what's silly, she breathed. For a little while yesterday, I forgot. You've been shot and you're weak, Lemuel said practically. I'll do that remembering until you're better. That's good, she said, and a little smile crossed her lips before she was out again. Vampires like Lemuel did not have the gift of glamour, so he couldn't hide himself from the nurse, who came in an hour later, even if he wanted to. How'd you get in here? She demanded. No one's supposed to be in here. She wouldn't have been so abrupt if he hadn't scared her, he figured. That was why he kept his voice calm when he replied. I came to sit with my wife as soon as it was dark and I could rise, he said in a very reasonable voice. Olivia opened her eyes at the sound of voices. Ma'am, do you want this man here? Said the nurse asked Olivia directly. Olivia said, very much, and that was that. The nurse took a half step back because she couldn't help herself, and she said, Don't upset the patient, sir. Then she wheeled around and marched down the hall, rubber soles squeaking as she hurried. It feels weird to have someone looking out for me, Olivia said, a bit more to Lemuel's surprise. I feel the same, he admitted. It's strange, but strange good, as Fiji says. Fiji? As if the world triggered a flood of memories, Olivia gasped and tried to sit up. In an instant, Lemuel was on his feet and pushing her down with a hand that was like a weight of iron on her chest. Olivia lay back. Her eyes were wide, and she was panting with remembered panic. Lem, he was going to shoot me again, and she saved me. What happened to her? She's fine, he said. Now hush, Olivia, hush, calm. Tell me, it was Fiji who killed McGuire. Tears began oozing from Olivia's eyes. They trickled down to her hair. Lemuel took a corner of the sheet and patted her eye. Poor Fiji, Olivia said. She had to kill someone because of me. She was willing, Lemuel said cautiously. I always hoped that Fiji could stay herself. This didn't make a lot of sense to Lemuel. Fiji was still herself. She just added another experience to her repertoire. But he could tell it was an important thought to his Olivia, so he simply waited for her to elaborate. There we go. She won't be the same, Olivia said. When it seemed clear she wasn't going to say anything else, Lemuel said, she always been stronger than anyone seemed to think. I know you're thinking, Olivia never liked Fiji that much anyway, so why is she so upset? Olivia said. Lemuel hadn't been thinking any such thing, but he felt it was wiser to nod. Thing is, Olivia stopped and turned her head a little. Lemuel realized that that was his cue to wipe her face again, and he did so with tenderness. Thing is, I do like your father. I was just envious. Everyone likes Fiji. She's sunny and cheerful. She bakes bread. I wanted her to stay that. I wanted her to stay that way. Well, I kind of hated her for having all of that. So now that she's killed someone and she has to complete a ritual to front of an audience, you are distressed. Lemuel understood. Sooner or later, she was bound to do something that would serve. That would serve to keep herself safe, and sooner or later, she was bound to have sex with Olivia. She's bound to have sex, Olivia. That is not the point, Olivia said, and you know it. Lemuel felt completely at sea. I'm sorry, he said, because that seemed a safe thing to say. Me too, Olivia said, in a voice so low he had to bend forward to understand her, even with his sharp hearing. I have to be there for her, Olivia said, in a stronger voice. I have to get out of the hospital in time to be there. If they don't let you go, I'll give you some blood, Lemuel promised. Would you like some now? Olivia said. They've only done that during sex before. It's wonderful to exchange blood when we are being man and woman, but you would heal faster now if you had some of my blood. I would love to heal faster. Bring it. Lemuel had wondered at first if Olivia was seeking a relationship with him because his blood would heal wounds much faster. In her line of business, quick healing was an undeniable plus. It might mean the difference between life and death. Lemuel hadn't volunteered blood giving or taking when this connection had become sexual. He had been waiting for Olivia's cue. If she had brought up blood first, he would have been even more cautious in letting her relationship develop. But Lemuel had become assured that whatever Olivia wanted from him, quick healing was not on her agenda. Without hesitation, Lemuel opened his own wrist and offered it to her. He was amused to see that she made a little face. A little bite in the heart of passion was very different from exchange, but his Olivia was nothing if not determined. She managed several good gulps before she fell back on the pillow. Thanks, she said in a somewhat stronger voice. No fun, but functional, huh? When you come home, dearest dear, we will spend good times together, Lemuel promised. Sounds like a plan, Olivia said. Sounds great. She smiled at him and fell asleep. Lemuel stayed by her bedside until nearly dawn. Olivia slept while the other nurses came in and checking their vital signs. They mostly pretended he wasn't there or gave a little nod in instruction without meeting his eyes. He was used to this, and it might not bother him. The price, he said, for being able to take energy rather than blood from people was that he stood out sharply from the herd, was unmistakably not human. Even when he did take blood, he did not look like himself. He did not look lifelike. Now Lemuel wondered if he was along with the other citizens in Midnight would would live to see many more days. It all hinged on Fiji. To Lemuel, who had never been modest about his body, Fiji's sacrifice seemed maybe not, not trivial, to Lemuel, since to Lemuel's sex was a very private thing, but a low priority in the grand scheme of things. A woman's Fiji's age somehow should not balk at such a sacrifice. Lemuel himself would not. Lemuel himself would not. If she had been a dewy teenager, he might have held another opinion, and Lemuel understood the procedure would not be pleasant. But then having a demon loose on the town would not be pleasant either, and that would affect many more people. Though Lemuel had told Fiji that he must be off her list of potential partners as a married man, during the long hours of night, he wondered if some chance occurrence would force him to take the role. In the remote case, Lemuel hoped that Olivia would forgive him. Olivia's forgiveness was not an easy process to Lemuel's side, the air stirring in his dead lungs. He watched her sleeping profile. He could do nothing. He could do anything for her. You're caught, gun and paper, he admitted to himself. When the vampires could feel the very first tinge of dark approaching, he slipped out under the hospital wing and got in his car. He siphoned energy along the wall from a sleeping orderly slumped on a chair, a visitor in the waiting room who was dead on the world, a middle-aged woman recovering from minor surgery. A sip of life force here. Lemuel was in his room, below the pawn shop 30 minutes before the sun rose. He slept the sleep of the dead. Chapter 34. If Fiji had trouble focusing the next day, though there was plenty to keep her busy. The past few years, children from Davie came to see her decorated Halloween houses and take a cookie from her helped tray. Her yard was deliciously scary, and most of the Midnighters helped her out in one way or another. She had celebrated Samhain by herself, and that was a pleasure too. But this year, Halloween and Samhain were on the same day. Saturday night, as the waning moon, midnight, was going to be scaling for it's here for real. Fiji had been get the world out. So had to get the word out so trick-or-treaters wouldn't flock to the witch's house. And as her Halloween extravaganza was called, she held about spreading the news in as many ways as she could. Manfred made a list of local online sites. The area swap and shop page. Fiji wrote a notice for Manfred to post on every single site. Fiji called the Davie and Marthasville papers to ask if they were doing a Halloween activity story. Both were. In view of the recent deaths in Midnight, I thought it would be in bad taste to have a big celebration here, she explained. I'm sure everyone will understand. To cut down on the disappointment, it would be so helpful if you could include that in your story. I didn't want to add, and you may get eaten by a demon, Fiji told Manfred, who dropped by because he thought he really ought to. In truth, he was feeling more than a little self-conscious around her. Fiji could tell. Fiji was horribly aware that her virginity and its impending loss was on everyone's mind. It would be safer to be it would be harder to be in a more humiliating situation. She considered several plans to extricate herself from the predicament, But every step she pondered seemed to end in making things worse, not better. In, in her most holden heart, Peachy wondered what would have happened if nothing volunteered. Partner, oh yeah, sorry. If nobody volunteered to partner her. Oh my God, how sacrificing would that be? She muttered. Peachy had not often stupid or silly. She realized that a public ritual was not a love tryst, but she harbored a hope that the man who completed his part of the deed at least showed some enthusiasm. If one of the angels had to sacrifice himself to do that, he would not be able to show her face from the rest of her life. The idea for poor Joe or poor Chewy on top of her, pumping away without lust or love, well, it just made her wince with mortification. You have company soon, Manfred said, and she pulled herself out of her black thoughts. Peachy back at the door. Sorry. Peachy back was to the door, and she turned to face it. She was regretting opening the shop. Her customer was probably the odious Willeen or some other dabber. Peachy was surprised to see Lenore Whitefield from the hotel. She seldom saw Lenore and had only spoken to her once or twice. Lenore was bursting with things to say. There was no mistaking the look, but she stopped in her tracks when she saw Manfred. Hi, Fiji said. Was there something I could help you with, Lenore? Yeah, Lenore said hesitantly. Your name is Fiji, right? Fiji nodded, and nodded. Right, Fiji. And this is Manfred Bernardo from across the river. Sure. Hi, Mr. Bernardo. I hope Tommy and Susie and Mammy are well. I miss having at the hotel. Though, like Safe Harbor, what they do miss midnight, Manfred said, trying to be tactful. Please call me Manfred. Still, Lenore hesitated. Something's on the other side. Lenore? He tried to be gentle, but she was conscious of the clock ticking. The second you get one of those going. Lenore took a big step into the store, committing herself to a conversation. When the hotel opened, the project himself was kept telling me that the market research was still proven that the hotel was in a good spot for his purposes. A place far old and people to stay while they waited for an opening in assisted living. And if we had the divider use, with part of it being for a regular hotel and customers and part of it being for more extended stays, the hotel would be able to make a profit. She paused, and to give her some kind of confirmation that they were on a tracker, Fiji said, right. Lenore said, me and Harvey, we needed jobs bad, and we were really glad to be picked out of the other worlds who applied for the job. Ava Colhane, she ran the interviews. It took Fiji a few seconds to remember that Ava Colhane had been the project manager who had been on site while the hotel was being renovated. She had not, by Joe's account, been warm or fuzzy or anything about brisk and efficient. I noticed that the couples who got asked to come back for a second round, they were more like us, Lenore said. They didn't have any other family with them. Well, even that made sense. Not too many people with little kids would want to settle in Manhattan midnight. Manfred and Fiji followed in unison, like bobblehead dolls. Sorry, Fiji thought. Naturally, I talked to the other women while we were waiting, Lenore said. As you do. Sure, Fiji said. Manfred looked blank, and it seemed to me that we were the saddest of the lot. Peachy opened her mouth to say something to refute that automatically, and then she realized she had better wait and see what the bottom line on this conversation was going to be. What do you mean? Manfred asked practically. I mean that we didn't have any kids at all, not even grown kids who would come to visit or anything, or living parents, or brothers, or sisters. Well, Harvey's got a brother in Alaska, but they haven't talked in 5 years. I guess no close connections, Manfred summarized briskly. Lenore nodded. This didn't make any difference to my husband, but it worried me a little. Some of the other couples, the man was a good plumber or carpenter, or had some executive experience, like running a couple of holiday inns or like that. But not Harvey, Fiji said. Not Harvey. He worked on the line for a factory that made salsa for 20 years. When he got laid off work, he couldn't find another job to save his soul. He tries to help, but he just hasn't got the skills. So we hired a teacher to come and do repairs. I kind of wanted to lie to Miss Culhane about that. I understand, Fiji said. I suppose I would have to. Eventually, Lenora would get to the point. Culhane didn't check up on us that night. Lenora went off, and that seemed pretty strange to me, considering how finicky she was about to everything else. It was like she was looking for the least qualified person than the best qualified. Sorry, it was like she was looking for the least qualified rather than the best qualified. See what I mean? Peachy nodded again, said, I do see. But I was so glad to get the job, which included a place to live, Lenore said doggedly, and I ignored all the signals. If Fiji nodded one more time, she thought her head would fall off. I understand, she said. It was impossible to read Manfred's expression. He was watching Lenore with apparent fascination. It comes to me too late, after we've already gotten there, that we'd been sucked in something that might kill us, Lenore said. Okay, why do you think? Manfred didn't have to answer the question. Me and Harvey were expendable, Letman said with some dignity. To them, anyway. I've tried my best to make I will try my best to make the hotel nice, to run it so it makes money. I knew the first batch of old people we got them from Nevada. They weren't really waiting for assisted living places. They were window dressing to make it look like the hotel was really that cool. Really what Culhane said it was. You're absolutely right about that, Manfred said. Someone has paid to put them in an expensive place. But you know that. I want to know who actually is footing the bill and why. It's something to do with Olivia, Lenore said. Fiji could have danced with relief. The point was in sight. What about Olivia, she thought. I don't know, Lenore said. But it's to do with her. I'll tell you something. Some of the guests really do go over a magic portal every day to consult there, whatever that means. But let's see, whatever that means. But whoever's in the top front room at the corner stays in almost all the time watching. Oops, hang on. Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for popping in. It's nice to see you. Happy Friday. let's see, where was I? I think you were very brave to come tell us this, Fiji said to Lenore. I really appreciate it. And while you're here, I have a thing or two to tell you. I was going to come by later today. Really, Lenore seemed a little excited that Fiji had planned on visiting her, which made Fiji feel like a scumbag. Here's the thing, Fiji said. This year Halloween is going to be quiet at midnight. Oh, Lenore looked doubtful. I know, but last year's a lot of people came to town to enjoy your house and yard. Yes, and that was fun, Fiji smiled at Lenore. But this year, we've heard that with the weird suicides and the shootings, and something really serious might happen. That sounds pretty bad, Lenore sighed deeply, her eyes fixed on the wall as soon as as she thought, okay, I'll arrange for a party for the residents in the evil room, and I'll talk to the transient guests. I really do appreciate the warning. No problem. I should have come by earlier, Fiji said. She felt both awkward and unworthy. Harvey especially should stay in, Manfred said abruptly. What? Olivia turned to face him, looking puzzled. You know I'm a psychic, Manfred said, trying to smile and failing. I think Harvey will be in extra danger. It was clear to Fiji that Lenore was conflicted. The hotel manager didn't know whether to be pleased that Manfred had thought enough of Harvey to warm him, or if she found the whole idea so ridiculous that she didn't give it any credence at all. Thanks, Lenore said. I remember that. After she left, Manfred and Fiji were left to look at each other in a resigned way. It was a real vision, Manfred said finally. I know, Fiji replied, and you've told her. If she doesn't believe, she doesn't believe. And frankly, I think we have enough on our plates to worry. Are you still hearing the voice? Not today, but I feel him move, and more. He's flexing, and I saw the rev carting off more dead animals this morning. He's building up his strength. Abruptly, Manfred said, If it's me, Fiji, I'll man up, I promise you. He smiled at her in what he meant to be a reassuring way, but Fiji had a suspicion he was thinking of Estella. Thanks, Manfred, she said, trying to hide her own lack of enthusiasm under a steady voice. When she was alone, Fiji felt dismissal again. Even the guys were worried about having sex by appointment. Well, at least one guy, though she realized that had little or nothing to do with her as a woman, and she understood the sacrifice required of her. She was unhappy and anxious to get it over with, which is not the way you should feel about the first time you have sex. At least that had always been in her impression. If she survived to see November 1, her life would be her own again. Chapter 35. All right. Okay. Next day was Halloween and Samhain and Saturday and the Wandering Moon and the longest day in the history of the world if you were Fiji. To everyone's astonishment, a warm front came in from the west. The skies poured rain in the morning and early afternoon. The roads and sidewalks were washed clean. The front window of Midnight Pond was streaked with drops that blew under the awning. Fiji's garden, in its last hurrah before winter, looked fresh and vivid. Inside the inquiring mind, Mr. Snuggles gently tucked himself under Fiji's counter to be safe from the thunder. The Rev went to the chapel under a giant and ancient umbrella. He asked Daedric to dust and vacuum his house, which Daedric was glad to do. It didn't seem like a good morning to be kneeling in the little chapel. In his room at Midnight Hotel, Quinn worked on the details of a sort of quinceañera within the half-demon clan in New Orleans. When he couldn't distract himself with that any longer, Quinn again read over the translated account of the ritual as Arya Aklina, a Etruscan vampire, and written it down scores of years before. Aklina had heard this account firsthand from the witch involved, but she hadn't been present. Lemuel had sent them all copies so that they would understand what had to be done. Quinn had to hope that nothing essential had been lost in translation. Fiji was studying the ritual too. Olivia came back to midnight, fetched by Bobo over her protests. He carried her in, wrapped in a raincoat. He helped her down to the stairs and turned down the covers so that she could climb into bed in her own apartment in her own pajamas. Though Olivia was doing so well, her doctor was dumbfounded. The transition exhausted her. After Bobo left, she promptly fell asleep. She woke to lightning, which she could glimpse out the windows, peeking just above the ground level. Lemuel still slept, of course, but she knew he was in the next room. She was the only person at midnight who was deeply happy. Daedric worried about his part in the evening preparations as he cleaned. The salt, now mixed with the ash of the hawthorn tree, was in a tub in the chapel. He and his father were charged with sprinkling the mixture on the circle they'd drawn around the crossroad. But if it kept raining, he didn't know what they'd do. Underlying his worry about the weather and the excitement of the potential demon rampage, Daedric was hoping Fiji might choose him to participate in the final part of the ritual. Daedric was more than ready. Manfred was busy with his usual workload. He paused, though, to think about Estella Hardin. He'd gone out with her a couple of times now, and those evenings had been very good. He hoped like hell he would have more evenings with Stell, but that week he'd been avoiding the intimacy that would lead to sex, because he simply couldn't face having sex with Fiji, if that was his lot, and then going back to Stell, while keeping his evening events a secret. Cho and Chewie missed their dog and clung to each other. They put the clothes sign on the shop door. No one shopped for antiques or manicures in the rain at midnight, and they alone had faced a demon, so they knew what could happen to them this night. Lenore and the cook at the hotel collaborated on doing all the prep work for a Halloween dinner for the residents and those the transient group who wanted to participate. Lenore had talked to Madonna about making a pumpkin pie and a devil's food cake, and Madonna was in the kitchen at home cooking, working on those as she and teacher did the normal lunchtime preparations. The night before, Lenore had given Marina the task of preparing Halloween goodie bags containing hand lotion, tissues, candy corn, peanuts, an orange, and other odds and ends. Lenore had pointed out that Miranda seldom had anything else to do, a point that Marina had felt was quite unnecessary to emphasize. In truth, Marina was having a little trouble keeping up with the apparently unflagged sex drive that kept Daedric over at her side. Marina actually thought it would be nice to have an evening off. To the girl's surprise, after he'd prepared the goodie bags, Lenore had sent her home with instructions to come back in 2 nights. "Take Halloween off," Lenore had said. With a weak smile, Marina thought of calling Daedric, then decided she'd go party with him and friends from school instead. Bobo had gotten all the accounts of Midnight Pawn in order, just in case, he told himself, just in case. All the online forms were filled out. He'd gone over the inventory, and he'd made sure his will was in his bedside drawer. Bobo was determined to step forward for Fiji, but he wondered if he would survive the process. He wanted to be ready. He thought of Fiji every other minute and was sorry this day would not be so fraudulent for her. She was so kind and good. Despite Manfred's warning, Lenore did not keep tabs on her husband, which was a pity. Harvey Whitefield hadn't been a binge in a long time, but the day something about the pounding rain made his resolution collapse utterly, and he drove to Davy to a liquor store and bought a bottle of bourbon, saying nothing to his wife, who was very busy in the kitchen and in the hotel, putting out decorations for a party that suited Harvey fine. He got a liter of Coca-Cola and a glass from the pantry, bought some ice in a bucket, and retired to an empty room in the hotel to have his own private party. He watched the game show channel on the flat screen, though he wasn't sure at remembering the answers. The questions made him feel smart, and he was gleeful at having successfully dodged his wife. The three senior citizens who were in Midnight Hotel suites, waiting for an opening at the Assisted Living Center in Davie or the one in Marthasville, played cards and read or listened to audiobooks according to their eyesight activity. They liked the break in monotony provided by the rain and thunder, and they had a pleasant, cozy day. It got dark even earlier than usual in October. They were all good to switch on the nearest lamp. The four people who were transient guests at the Midnight Hotel went about their business. The three genuine tech support people actually drove to Magic Portal, even on a Saturday. They had a productive day at the gaming company. Their Magic Portal colleagues invited the three of them to the party, and he would party that would start immediately after work that day, and they all accepted gladly. Working with the Magic Portal people was more fun than anything they'd ever done. The fourth person was the man renting the second floor front room, which overlooked the pawn shop. Lenore understood he was a writer, and that was why he stayed in the room. Almost all the time there had been certainly a laptop in his room, and he always seemed to be working when Lenore cleaned his room. The past 2 days, he'd seemed very jittery, and he was never without his phone in his hand. He told Lenore he might check out at any time. He seemed surprised and pleased to get a special Halloween treat brought up on a tray by the boy who usually worked in the evening. "Why are you on duty during the day?" the man asked. "The girl quit," Daedric answered. "Enjoy." Left alone with the tray, the man had to admit it looked interesting. There was a small pitcher of sangria, sangria with lots of fruit in it, carefully covered with a paper frill, and a cheese and cracker plate with a bit of honeycomb. The note on the tray said, "Have a happy Halloween." He took the tray on his chair he took the tray on his chair and table. Wow, what? He took the tray to his chair. And table arranged by the window to keep his vigil. He drank the pitcher of sangria and picked out the cheese and crackers and honeycomb. He didn't wake until 3 a.m. Next morning, courtesy of Joe and Chewy, who entrusted Daedric with the delivery. Underneath the rock, dirt, and asphalt, the demon Kolkanar stirred. He was not quite strong enough yet. He needed more blood. He would rise. He would have the witch in every way it was possible to have her. He began summoning anyone weak enough to listen. He found someone very weak and very close. Harvey Whitefield had dozed off from the liquor and the drumming of the rain in the empty hotel room. He woke thinking he'd heard someone call his name. He felt a surge of guilt because he was sure his wife was looking for him. But to Harvey's astonishment, the voice was one he never heard before. Harvey lurched to his feet, looking from side to side to find a source of the summons. He went to the door and listened. Nothing on the landing, but he could still hear his name. He opened the door just a bit and looked around. There was no one there. He could hear very faintly the sound of the old geezers in the common room on the ground floor. They were talking about how to play Texas Hold'em and debating how many books Nora Roberts had written. Harvey wasn't interested in either subject, so it was easier for him to listen to the voice. In fact, he found it impossible to ignore. After a second, he stepped out of the room and went down the stairs unsteadily on his feet. It was unlucky for Harvey that the stairs were carpeted, or he would have made quite a lot of noise, and maybe someone would have stopped him. But that didn't happen. Harvey was supposed to be on duty at the desk, of course, but who'd even noticed that he wasn't there? No one. Marina would be on duty in a few minutes. Harvey did not know that Lenore had given Marina the night off. There was a bell on the desk anyway to summon help if a traveler should stop in. Like anyone ever did, this damn place. Harvey hardly realized he was crossing the lobby floor to the doors. No one saw him leave, and the tinkle of chime on the door didn't even register to the little group in the common room. They could only hear the rain beating down. Harvey was soaked to the skin within seconds of stepping outside. He dimly understood what he was doing now. Now that he could hear the voice more clearly, I didn't have a gun or a knife or anything sharp-edged with me. But she realized it was his fault. The two queers across the road would sell him I would sell him a blade, but their knives were all antiques. The pawn shop had knives, but they were under lock and key. The bitch who ran that witch shop had knives, but she always looked at him like he was the problem she had to solve. Then the demon supplied him with a good idea. Harvey lay down on the road, just a little out of the direction radius of the spotlight. In the heavy rain, the green light without even noticing the bumps. The demon was delighted at the rich meal, and he felt more bloodied a bit farther afield. He then began pulling the really ripe one, the really tasty one that one of the witch despised. And Kiki, who'd been staying at a hotel in Marthasville with the cowboy she met at the cartoon saloon the day that she left at midnight, accelerated in her drive to the crossroads where she had to be now. Oh my goodness. Chapter 36. The rain stopped at 4:30 through the clouds, though the clouds did not clear, and Quinn and his son went out immediately to sprinkle the salt and ash on the outline of the circle. In the gloom, the two didn't spot the body until they were halfway around. More than one truck had passed through by then, so it wasn't a recognizable shape. Though Daedric had the strong stomach of a tiger, he vomited after he realized he was looking at Harvey Whitefield. We can't call the police, Quinn said. They'll be here forever, and we have to do this tonight. But Mrs. Whitefield, Daedric protested. She should know he liked Lenore, who had always been nice to him. Unlike Harvey, Daedric wasn't grieved for the man, but for his wife. She should, yes, but we can't risk a demon. We can't risk a demon rising while the cops are here, Quinn said reasonably. What do we do with him? Let's move him to the side so no one will worry about him until the ritual is over. And if the ritual doesn't work, his body will be the least of our worries. They did move the body, which was very unpleasant, and they covered it with an old sheet of plastic the Rev used when he was digging graves in the animal cemetery. Then the two were-tigers resumed their task. The salt and ash mixture struck to the painted line very well because of the damp air and wet pavement. Do you think Fiji is scared? Daedric asked quietly. He was carrying the bucket, and Quinn was using a large scoop to distribute the mixture. She is. Sure she is, Quinn said. For a human, this must feel degrading. They're very modest about no clothes in public. Let's switch, Daedric suggested. And when they had scooped in the bucket, he said they don't have to talk about sex even when they've had it either. Even when they've had it with you. You have to go with your feelings, Quinn said philosophically. If she picks one of us, if she gets pregnant, Will the child be one of us? We talked about this when you began. We talked about this when you began to want Marina. The baby would grow up to be. Chances are also good that the child would be athletic and strong, but no, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be able to change. Daedric slowly pitied after such a child. I hope someday I can find a tigress, Dad, he said. Let's see. Oops. I found your mother, Quinn said, and I've given up hope. If there's one tigress, there could be more. Absolutely. Quinn looked over at the chapel to see the Rev standing on the steps. Daedric, run tell the Rev about Harvey and ask him to say a word over the body, Quinn said. And Daedric hurried over the old cleric. Quinn saw that Rev nod and walk unhurriedly to the deformed corpse to kneel beside it. The moment he did, a half-familiar car swerved up and almost hit the Rev. It proved he still had excellent reflexes. The old man threw himself to the left. Daedric and Quinn were only a few feet away. They both left further, startled and furious. A woman got out, a woman who smelled familiar, too. It's Fiji's sister, Daedric said, but Quinn was already moving to intercept Kiki, who was staggering towards the intersection. Luckily, no vehicles were coming, but Kiki lay down to wait for her death. She screamed when Quinn yanked her up by her arm. Fiji's door opened and she ran out, afraid the demon was breaking free early. She dashed towards the struggling group. The demon screamed, too, in outrage and desire, and he moved so powerfully that the ground began to tremble. As doors flew open and the people of midnight poured out of their houses, Kiki struggled with the were-tigers. She was intent on dying. The Rev sent Fiji to fetch a rope from the tool shed to bind her, and the three men managed to get her into the chapel. Fiji said, I need to be with her. Quinn said, no, we can deal with her. We called her to hurt you. You have to be mentally ready for tonight. He's trying to distract you. Fiji began to protest, but then she thought, he was drawing people who didn't like me. He was able to draw my sister. And she trudged back into her house. The chapel was cold and damp, but at least Kiki couldn't commit suicide if she was secured inside. Kiki was tied up hand and foot as a matter of fact. As the three were-tigers left the chapel, the Rev, for the first time ever, locking the door behind him, Bobo held open the front door of the pawn shop while Lemuel carried Olivia out. Bobo reached in to grab a stadium seat with an awning, and after he'd expanded it, Lemuel lowered Olivia into it with great care. Olivia looked pale under the pawn shop light. She was dressed in flannel pajamas with a padded vest over them and socks with moccasins on her feet. Lemuel covered her with a blanket. He was taking no chances. Joe and Chewy, hand in hand, walked down from the store to stand at the corner opposite the pawn shop. Manfred emerged from his house to stand with Bobo. And to everyone's surprise, the Reeds walked over from their trailer to take a post on the sidewalk in front of the hotel. Grady was bundled up in a pram-type stroller. Madonna looked resentful but resigned, and she glared around as if daring anyone to make something of her presence. Teacher looked almost pleased. They were both carrying guns. They nodded at Sylvester, who was wearing jeans and nothing else. He was ready at the gas-and-go corner. Midnight seemed to fall silent. Chapter 37. Inside her front door, Fiji was praying, and praying hard. She thought of all the lives that had been lost at the crossroads in the past few weeks, both human and animal, and she knew she had to stop this from going any further. But this was a bitter pill to swallow, and she almost choked. She shook her head angrily, exasperated with the weak side of herself, and told herself to be more like her aunt. She flung open the door and stepped onto the porch, Mr. Snuggles at her side. Fiji's hour had come. She felt weirdly like the bride arriving at the entrance to the church, except instead of wedding regalia, Fiji wore a green silk robe. She saved it for a big night that had never happened. Tonight she got to appear naked in front of everyone she knew, have sex, and save the world. If that didn't constitute a big night, she didn't understand the meaning of the phrase. She'd also dropped 5 pounds since she had learned she had had to drop her drawers, as Aunt Mildred had put it. But that had been from sheer anxiety. Standing alone under her front porch light, knowing everyone was waiting for her, Fiji struggled to suppress her squeamishness and her bit of vanity and her performance anxiety. For a split second, she was tempted to scream and run back inside. Though it was night, the clouds seemed to be skittering away, and the moon was out. Fiji remembered her sister, so anxious to meet her own death. And Fiji could feel the demon below, moving and murmuring, yearning for her. She felt Mr. Snuggles' soft fur rub against her leg. Her lesser concerns about her body, about the feeling of men around her, fell away. These were small issues. She had big work to do. The relief of this realization was sublime. Fiji began to cast the spell she'd found in Aunt Mildred's spellbook. Its purpose was to close the town to outside notice. She didn't know how often Mildred had reason to use the spell, but she also had no reason to doubt its efficacy. Sylvester, whom she saw standing under the awning of Gas and Go, was using a similar spell. And as she repeated the words over and over, her hands moving in disseminating circles, she began to feel the cone tightening around the crossroad and enclosing all of them inside. She had a fleeting impulse to giggle, thinking of the cone of silence, but it vanished as she could discern more clearly exactly what it was she was sealing them in with. The rest of the world drifted away, leaving only the people of midnight and the demon. Lemuel stood up and walked forward as Fiji stepped down from her porch and walked to the intersection to stand under the stoplight. Abruptly, the stoplight froze on yellow. They were caught in its eerie glow. Lemuel read from a page. Fiji Kavanaugh, witch of this town, do you agree to protect this place with your body and soul? Fiji nodded. She had hoped it would be a graceful gesture, but she felt her head jerk. She took a deep breath, trying to relax. Then she gave that up as impossible. I will, she said. Her voice was level. Lemuel said, do you agree to sacrifice your virgin blood to appease that lies below? To seal the demon below us for another 250 years, I agree, Fiji said. She turned east. I call in the air for wisdom. She turned south. I call in the fire for courage. Her voice faltered. After a moment's recovery, she rotated another quarter, turned to face west. I call on water for cleansing. Another quarter turn. And I call on the earth for strength, most of all. She paused. Help me defend this town and these people against the demon who threatened them. Bind him into the earth so he can't harm the earth's children. Men, Lemuel said, without raising his voice, but they all heard him. All the males in the town, except Teacher, came to stand beside Lemuel, who was glancing down at the pages of script. Fiji could not meet anyone's eyes. Mr. Snuggles glided smoothly past her and sat looking up at the men. And then she realized that one of them had moved. Bobo had fallen to his knees. Silently, he held out his hand to Fiji, and there was no way even an insecure woman like Fiji could misinterpret the invitation. Really? She said, embarrassed that her voice was shaking. It would be an honor, he said, and even Fiji could not doubt his sincerity. There was love in his voice. I failed you before, I won't fail you now. She tried hard not to cry, but a tear ran down her cheek. The other men stood silent, waiting, all of them with emotion she could just detect. To her astonishment, some of them were disappointed when she took Bobo's hand to lead him to the center of the circle, and she held her head a little higher. Shuey and Joe revealed their true selves as they moved apart to opposite sides of the circle. Their swords glowed, their wings spread. Manfred took a place a few feet away from Shuey and Lemuel, an equal distance from Joe. Sylvester stepped into place, and he was chanting in a language none of them could understand. Teacher moved into a vacant spot with a shotgun. Madonna, too, joining the circle. The three were-tigers joined in, and finally, as if she could not help herself, Olivia rose and made her way painfully, slowly, to join them. Fiji raised Bobo up, and he bent to kiss her. It was everything she had ever hoped for, even under the public circumstances. She began to feel heat moving through her, and there was no mistaking the fact that Bobo was feeling the same way. This was not a time to speak. Wordlessly, she loosened the tie of her robe and let it slip down, and stood back, her eyes straight ahead. She held herself rigid as Bobo looked at her until he said, "Look at me." She did, and read only delight there. Bobo stripped off his sweatshirt, and she stepped in to unbuckle his belt and unzip his pants. He dropped them in a heap, and Mr. Snuggles sat on the discarded clothes, his golden eyes glowing. Though it was nipping cold, Fiji, full of magic, willed them to be warm, and they were. She had power she had never imagined, and it dazed her. Fiji knew the moment when Kolkanar realized the ritual was taking place above him. He began to move with increasing violence and purpose, clawing his way to the surface, slowly and sluggishly. She should have been terrified. Instead, Fiji was possessed by a sure confidence in her power and her womanhood. She and Bobo kissed again, longer, and this time they lay down on the road. Bobo tried to interpose himself between Fiji and the cold, muddy asphalt, but she said, "I have to touch the ground." He nodded, and she lay on her back. She looked up at him, knowing he could see that she loved him. She was not afraid now of his knowing that. She forgot other people were there. "Are you ready?" Bobo asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. They could both hear the demon now, and they knew they could not spend any more time on preliminaries. "Oh, yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. She lusted for him with a pure brightness. He pushed into her. It stung. She knew she had bled a few drops and was thankful. She thought, not a virgin anymore. They could stop right now, and the ritual would be satisfied. But she would not be. Her body had a mind of its own, and the mind said, hell no. She realized in a far part of her brain that she needed not have had performance anxiety. She certainly knew how to do this. She and Bobo moved together as if they had done it a dozen times. Despite everything that should have prevented her pleasure, the spectators, the weather, the discomfort of lying on cold pavement, Fiji found herself getting close to climax, which she had never expected. Magic was gathering around her and Bobo like a thick cloud, but Kolkanar was very close to the surface. He was still moving upward, so it wasn't just the virginity or the virgin blood that counted. She realized dimly. A taloned hand burst through the asphalt. The demon was dark red, or at least it looked that way in the glimpse Fiji had before her body demanded all her attention. The other hand appeared, and Kolkanar began to heave himself out of the ground. But still, Fiji and Bobo kept up their movement. Kolkanar's talons were almost at Bobo's leg. Fiji saw the shadow of a lion, small but unmistakable. She knew it was there to protect her. She forgot it, let the magic build and build, her body moving with Bobo's, her hands on his back, stroking, digging in, urging him on even when a dark talon pierced his leg and his blood spurted, blending with hers. He screamed, but with her hand on him, he did not stop moving in and out of her. With his second scream, he exploded inside her, and at that moment, her power flared outward. Kolkanar bellowed. The sound was so loud Fiji's ears rang. The demon's emerging arm, as big around as a man's thigh, flailed to try to reach Fiji. But Bobo stayed on top of her to protect her, though his injury was terrible. The shadow line stood over them. It had grown to giant size. Its shadowy form snarled and bit at the demon's arm. Bright purple blood splattered the ground, already stained with Fiji and Bobo's blood. Fiji's brilliant power lit up the scene like a floodlight, and the light made the demon's skin bubble and hiss. With the terrible sounds of a building collapsing, Kolkanar slid back underneath the Texas soil. In the sudden silence, Fiji heard someone begin clapping. Then everyone joined in, many hands. As she and Bobo looked into each other's eyes, and he kissed her yet again, she figured that clapping was the only way the residents of Midnight could think of to express their profound relief that they were not going to be eaten, and to thank her for her protection and sacrifice. "Not so much," she said, "not such a sacrifice. Maybe we can get into a warm bed and sacrifice again real soon." Bobo seemed reluctant to get off of her and get up, and she could understand that. She would like to revel in the moment too, but the world intruded, and she knew her magic would not be able to hold the scene for long, even with Sylvester's chant. "That sounds very good to me." She could tell the moment Bobo felt the full impact of the injury. He hissed and rolled off to her side. "Plus, we need to look at that leg of yours," she said prosaically. "It hurts a hell of a lot. Damn, this is literally anticlimactic," Bobo said. She began to giggle. He sat up and she scrambled to her feet. She looked down for her silk robe and found it lying in a dirt-streaked heap a few feet away. Bobo's own clothes were not in much better shape, and his jeans were decorated lavishly with cat hair, though Mr. Snuggles was nowhere in sight. Perhaps he was enjoying being a lion. Lemuel and Quinn helped Bobo to her feet and half carried him to Fiji's house. After a moment of hesitation, You have some cleaning up to do, the Rev said in a creaky voice. You're still beaming. After a moment, Fiji realized he meant magical cleaning up. She was the source of the light around the crossroad. Okay, she would figure this out. She ratcheted down her magic, unfocusing her will to dissolve the bubble that had kept the world out. As she did so, she saw that all the ghosts of the town were clustered around the ash and salt circle, interspersed with living people. Aunt Mildred was standing next to Chewy, and a Mexican cowboy in clothes of 100 years before he was looking at Olivia, who resumed her seat on the steps of the pawn shop. Though she was fascinated and would have liked to spend moments looking at every face, next instant a car's headlights were coming from the west, from Marthasville, and the cold pinched her skin, and she realized that she had to get inside or risk getting arrested. She felt her weariness in her bones, plus a very pleasant sense of relaxation and a sight of achiness. She caught a glimpse of the body of Harvey Whitefield, but someone else would have to take care of that particular problem. Fiji gathered up her clothes hurriedly and started for her house. She sensed someone in front of her and looked up to discover her sister, who had somehow wiggled out of her bonds. What did I just see? Kiki said. Were you humping in the middle of the road? Did I just see something coming out of the asphalt? What do you think you saw? Fiji said, and took a step around Kiki. Go home, Kiki, and don't come back. She walked over to her house, finally locating Mr. Snuggles. He was sitting on the little wall around the porch next to a planter, and he looked proud, which meant he looked like all cats. But he nodded to her in a congratulatory way, and then set about cleaning his paws. For a moment, Fiji hesitated at the door, looking back. She could see a shadow surrounding the cat, a shadow that didn't match the domestic short-haired feline outline at all. But Fiji had opened the door an inch, and she could hear the water of the shower running. She could imagine the warmth of the water and the clean smell of her soap, and she knew Bobo was waiting for her to join him. She hoped Lemuel had healed his leg. If not, there was bandaging to do. She even looked forward to that. Fiji stepped inside and shut the door behind her. Chapter 38. The next morning, Fiji woke feeling like a new woman. The crisis was over. The demon was imprisoned. Bobo was asleep beside her. She had saved the world. She had had sex. Bobo loved her. She tried to track down the essential difference she felt in herself. She was still Fiji, still the least important person in a conscientious family, still a witch in a society that did not like witches, still round as a honeydew in a nation that revered stilt-like women. But now, she thought, I am powerful. It was a fact. Her feeling that she was transforming had begun before last night. In fact, when she had frozen the gunman the day of the assault on Olivia, the day she had killed McGuire, Arthur Smith would never stop asking questions about that day, and she would never be held responsible for any of it. She knew that, and despite the fact that everyone was always talking about how nice she was, she didn't feel guilty for having killed Ellery McGuire. It had been the only way to prevent the deaths of people she knew, people who were in her care. She wondered if Sylvester Ravenwood would stay, and she rather hoped he would. She wondered if Olivia would decide to become a vampire. She wondered if Joe and Chewy would ever be able to reattain heaven. And what would teacher Madonna do now that Olivia's father might come talk to Olivia directly? There was no need to protect her from Ellery McGuire any longer, Fiji figured. It felt good to have a future in which to contemplate all these things. She felt a little movement beside her and knew Bobo was awake. Hey, beautiful, he said. Another thing she knew was what he meant. Joe and Chewy had gotten up at their usual time, but instead of Joe going for his run and Chewy preparing breakfast, they jumped in their car and driven to the kennel where Rasta had been boarded. The Peke was bathed and groomed and ecstatic to see his people. Everyone who worked at the kennel agreed that if all gay people were as nice and modest and normal as Chewy Villegas and Joe Strong, they wouldn't mind having them around. Joe and Chewy drove back to midnight. If we can't ever go back home, Joe said, at least we have a dog. God, spelled backward, Chewy said. It was an old joke, but they always enjoyed it. Joe gave a silent sigh, sensing the near emergence of the demon had activated a hunger in him, a deep need he had suppressed for decades. He had wanted to fly, to defend heaven, but they had promised each other not to fly, and he was shackled to midnight. So you got to see Fiji buck naked, Madonna said, apropos some nothing to her husband. Me and everyone else in town, Teacher said cautiously. How'd that make you feel? He'd been folding laundry, and he kept on folding, though he also felt her eyes on him. Sorry for her, he said promptly. She didn't want to do that, and she's no kind of exhibitionist. You didn't think you'd like to get a piece? Madonna, he was genuinely shocked. You know I haven't touched another woman since we've been married. Uh-huh. But I also know you like women with curves, and that Fiji has got 'em. And they're not as jiggly as mine. Teacher said, Fiji has got nothing on you that you haven't got, and I love you. Which was absolutely the right answer, if it wasn't exactly accurate on all accounts. Later, Madonna said, You think Mr. Wicklow will keep us here, let us stay? Now that McGuire is dead? Well, I hope so. I like it here, to tell the truth. You? I'd like to try to make the restaurant a real concern, Madonna said. I've been kind of playing at it because I knew he'd keep us solvent no matter what. But if we really work, advertise and get us a hook, maybe we'll have the best pie in Texas or something. Maybe we can really make some money. Grady can have a car in high school. Madonna had always envisioned the teens in her area, but who could afford that luxury? That was her idea of the best you could hope for. We could learn the value of work that way, Teacher said. We tried not to sound excited. We wouldn't be beholden to anyone, Madonna said. Of course, we also wouldn't have a pension plan or health insurance. Let's see what the man says, Teacher said. Might be as he had planned we'd love. Might be, Madonna said. She was already thinking of new things she liked to put on the menu. Buying the house next to Fiji's had been the quickest real estate transaction in the history of home sales. The sole heir had been delighted to get $30,000 for a property he hadn't thought about in 10 years. Today, Quinn and Daderick started work on their new home. Quinn had some carpentry knowledge, and he enjoyed teaching his son what he knew. Marina broke up with me, Daderick said suddenly, just that he finished prying up the old tile in the bathroom. By text. How do you feel about that? Quinn continued on his way to the front door, where he tossed an old kitchen cabinet into a rented dumpster. I liked Marina, Daderick said, but I liked having sex with her more than I liked her, I think. Let me give you some advice. You may think that, but never, ever say it out loud to a woman. Why not? That's what every woman fears. Every woman wants to be liked because of who she is, her personality, not because she makes her sex organs available. So I should pretend? That was a puzzler. Quinn thought about it. Finally, he said, the perfect answer? Never to have sex with someone you don't genuinely like enough to hang around with. How am I going to do that? We're going to have a lot of conversations about this, Quinn predicted, and he was right. Though he didn't share his disappointment with Daderick, Quinn had hoped that Fiji would choose him the night before, that it would be him curled up beside her in bed the next door on the chilly morning. But Quinn looked at his son, and he realized that if he had so much luck already, maybe he would have some more. The Rev knelt in his chapel and prayed. There was always something to pray about, and the God of animals and humans was ready to listen. At least this time, the Rev could thank God for a long list of things. He was especially grateful that Kiki Kavanaugh had recovered from her spasm of madness enough to drive away all by herself late the night before. He would be even more grateful, he confessed to God, if he never saw the woman again. Lenore Whitefield had woken at 4 a.m. She could not have said exactly what had happened the evening before. She and the people in the hotel had stayed in all evening, not even approaching the windows, and had had a pleasant Halloween celebration, playing games and eating candy. But Lenore had been mighty irritated with Harvey because he hadn't shown up. She figured he'd gone to a bar to binge drink, something he did from time to time. He'd always come home before, and now the other half of the double bed was cold. Lenore rose and wrapped a fuzzy bathrobe around herself, made some coffee in the large kitchen. While it was perking, she looked out the little parking area for the staff, and she saw that Harvey's truck was still there. Lenore found that somewhat reassuring. After she'd had her coffee and gotten dressed, she began searching the hotel. Harvey was nowhere to be found, though she discovered a rumpled bed in one of the unoccupied rooms. There was an empty bottle, and the television was on the game show channel, all signs that Harvey had hidden in there to drink. Her worry congealed into a lump in her throat. Next, Lenore called Harvey's cell phone and listened to it ring. She tracked the sound back to the room he'd used, where she found it under the edge of the bedspread. This had never happened before. If his truck was here, Harvey was here. If Harvey was gone, the truck was gone. But he always answered his phone, and he always came home. By the time the sheriff knocked on the back door, Lenore had admitted to herself that she was pretty sure Harvey was dead. She was sad, and she felt free. Olivia woke suddenly, aware that she was still in bed with Lemuel, that he was cold and dead for the day. The previous evening had exhausted her, though she spared a smile in a moment to wonder how exhausted Fiji might be after spending the night with Bobo. They had gotten off to a good start if Olivia knew anything about sex at all, and she believed she did. Her phone rang, and her hand shot out to pick it up before the sound could disturb Lemuel. It was a silly reflex. Ringing would not disturb Lemuel in the slightest. "Hello," she said in her normal voice. "Melanie," said a man's voice. "No, this is Olivia," she said calmly. "You have the wrong number." "Don't hang up, it's your father," he said. She froze. It had been years since she'd heard his voice, and she hadn't recognized it because it had changed so much. "All right," she said, unable to settle on one feeling. "I'm so sorry, Melanie," he said. "I'm so sorry." "For what specifically?" "For leaving your care to your stepmother." "You finally admit I told you the truth?" "I do." "Huh." Olivia pulled the covers up until only her hand holding the telephone and her head remained uncovered. She wiggled closer to Lemuel, which was only a comforting emotionally. "I just didn't want to see it or believe it," Nicholas Wicklove went on, and she didn't speak. "I told myself that she needed the company of her younger friends and that it was nice she was paying so much attention to you. It never occurred to me that she was abusing you in such a terrible, terrible way. Even when I told you so, even when my brother told you, even then, Melanie, was her death really an accident?" "You're not famous for actually wanting to hear the truth, Dad." And Olivia hung up. She wasn't sure what she would do the next time he called, but there would be a next time. Maybe she wouldn't hang up then. Manfred Bernardo was taking Stell to lunch. She did not have to go into work tonight. She'd aced her last test, and she was in a good mood. They drove over to Marthasville with comfortable moments of silence and pleasant conversation when they thought of something to say. Despite the fact that he'd been up late the night before, or maybe for that very reason, he was delighted with the bright, cold day and the smooth, clean lines of Stell's face. He admired her red sweater and jeans and boots. He was learning more about her on every date. More importantly, all he was learning was good. Manfred liked women who could, and expected to, make their own way in the world. Both his grandmother and his mother had proved themselves capable of that. Manfred also liked women who didn't judge, and Stell didn't seem to have an issue with Manfred's occupation. She asked questions as she would about any unfamiliar job. He'd offered a choice of an upscale Mexican restaurant or the best Italian place in the area, and Stell had picked the Italian place. Manfred had only been there once, but the service and food had been good, so he was hoping that would prove to be the case that day. A large party went in right before them, but for once Manfred wasn't irritated about that. It would give him longer to talk to Stell. Their conversation covered the agonies of high school, the thrill of graduating and heading out into the world. Manfred's 1 year of JUCO while he tried to figure out how to make his psychic talent pay for him. Stell's ongoing education and how many years she had left. He asked her what kind of work she wanted to do when she got her degree. "I would be glad to work in a hospital for a few years," she said, and Manfred could tell that she thought about it. "But eventually I think I'd like to work in a doctor's office, less pay but regular hours and closed on weekends." "You've got a plan." "Yeah, you bet I do. My dad is on a yard crew for a landscaper, and my mom cleans houses. They're great people, but I don't want that for me. I have some ambition." "I like that," Manfred said. He looked at her, sitting across the table, and realized he knew so much about her. Her head and soul were telling him things about Stell that her mouth would not speak on such short acquaintance. "I like that a lot," he added with emphasis, and she smiled back. Sylvester Ravenwing stood just outside the door of the convenience store and surveyed midnight. The traces of the previous night were erased. He followed Kiki to a hotel in Davie and watched her check in. She would awake there sometime today and do whatever struck her fancy. He helped Quinn and Daedric to host the salt and ash off the White Circle, and when he called 911 to report the death of Harvey Whitefield before dawn the next morning, he felt a deep content. Sylvester liked this little town and his new job and his grandson. He thought he'd stick around for a while. Arthur Smith didn't spend much time thinking about the death of Harvey Whitefield. Harvey's record contained a dismaying number of DUIs. It was kind of ironic that he hadn't killed anyone else by driving, but he himself had died by being driven on, and there were a few questions about Harvey's actions. Yes, it was weird that he'd gone out without a coat on a cold and rainy night. Even drunks didn't get out much in that weather, and it was odd that he left his cell phone in the hotel room in his own hotel. But the results of the autopsy were pretty cut and dry. Harvey had been stinking drunk. Either he'd been hit by a truck while bending over, or he'd passed out on the road, being run over and killed him. That's all there is. There ain't no more, as the doctor said when he called Arthur after the autopsy. The doctor spared a moment to marvel that Harvey had been able to walk to the street, as drunk as he'd been. Arthur Smith listened with half of his attention. After all, it wasn't like Harvey had been murdered. The next night, Mr. Snuggles sat at the back porch of his house and listened with some disgust to the noises coming from within. It had been a long, quiet day. "The pawn shop isn't open," he muttered. "Neither is Fiji's shop. This is wrong and bad. How can she buy my food if she doesn't make any money today?" Fiji had explained that on slow days she still made a little money, but if the shop was closed, reasoned Mr. Snuggles, she would not make any, and therefore he might go hungry. He padded into the little pantry and counted the cans of cat food. He would be good for a week, and in that time she would get tired of staying in bed with Bobo Winthrop, and she would open the shop to sell things. Mr. Snuggles very generously decided to let Fiji have her way today and tonight. Tomorrow, though, he would be sure she went to work. After all, a cat had to eat. Yay! There you go, guys. There was that book. I finished. Haha. So, yeah, that was Night Shift, Book 3 of the Midnight Texas series by Charlaine Harris. And, yeah, I'm not really sure what the big series or whatever I'm going to read quite yet. The next is quite yet. But I'm going to finish Jurassic Park. I'm going to work on that one next. But gosh, if anybody's still there, thanks for listening. And if anybody hops in later and listens all the way through, congratulations on that too, because holy crap, I read a lot. And I imagine at some point it gets supremely boring. But yeah, thanks for sticking with me for so long. My goodness. The last couple chapters were incredibly slow. But yeah, so thank you, Mongo. It's nice to see you're still hanging in there. Oh my gosh. But yeah, gosh. So thank you, Brian and Dee Dee and Jeremy and Mongo for popping in here. It's super awesome. And wow, I guess this is a perfect time to end. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no quiz necessary. I trust that you remember all the information. Yeah, that's about right. And then maybe one day I'll read the short story that's kind of a prequel for this that has Manfred and Sicky Stackhouse in it. I like that one. It's kind of cute. But first things first, I have to finish my Jurassic Park series. So, yeah. So I'm going to end the stream now so I can go get some Z's. And thanks again, Mongo. It's great to have you around. And thanks to everybody else, too. So happy Friday night / Saturday morning if you're on the East Coast.